Hello, I'm Billy Wilson, and I'm going to give you an introductory tutorial on how I produce my work. First of all, the way I go about my work and the techniques I use take up a lot of time, but they give you more precision and influence on the product you create. In these tutorials, I'll take you from the basics to concepts, composition, lighting, editing, and more as part of my workflow. By taking my full course, you should learn how I go about all the steps in my work. To take full advantage of the course, you should have a camera capable of triggering off-camera flashes, a transmitter to trigger your flashes with, at least 2 flashes that you can trigger off-camera, light stands for your flashes, something to diffuse the light with from your flashes. It can be an umbrella like this, or a softbox bedsheet, or whatever you have available to you, and a tripod for your camera, and a computer with Photoshop CS. In my work, I like to craft images. I tend to come from the approach of asking myself, what do I have in mind that I want to create? I then go about all means I have available to me to achieve what I have in mind. I like everything in my work to be presented in a way that influences the observer. I go in depth in my editing to the smallest details, and I tweak and manipulate and craft everything together. Photoshop is a substantial component of my workflow, since it gives me very fine-grained control that I need. Using all of this control, I am able to produce work that is more in line with my vision. So by taking my course, you should be able to learn how to craft images together in the way that I do. For this part of the tutorial, I'm going to show you some of the methods that I use to ensure sharper images. First of all, I always have my camera set on a tripod. Another thing that I always use is a remote shutter release, which I have right here. It's a wired one. And I always have the camera set to mirror lockup mode, just in case that there is a little bit of vibration when I take a picture. So when I first press the remote shutter release, the mirror is locked up, and then I can wait a few seconds, and I press the shutter button again, and then it takes the picture. Another thing that I always ensure is that image stabilization is turned off, and that's usually located on your lens. I do this just in case that the lens tries to correct for motion when there is none. Although a lot of the image stabilization systems are actually able to detect if the camera is stable or not, I just turn it off just in case. Another thing that I try to do is always try to figure out what is the sharpest apertures with the lens I'm currently using. Usually it tends to be f5.6 or f8, but it's best to look up test results online, or to just take test shots yourself and see if it really even matters to you, because sometimes, you know, you just can't really care about the tiny bit of resolution that you're missing by shooting at a larger aperture, especially if a lot of the scene is blurred. Another thing that I always do is I use live view to focus. I find that this is a lot better than any viewfinder out there, because you could just pick a point in the frame, zoom in. Right here, this is at pixel level, and I can just focus. I never ever use autofocus. I only ever manually focus through live view. And this does an amazing job. Because a lot of lenses, you know, they back focus, they're a little off sometimes, or, you know, my style of shooting, there's no action in it. You know, you just have to get the focus right, and live view enables me to do that. So pretty well, those are the tips that I have for taking sharper images.
Hello. For this part of the tutorial, I'm going to show you some basic things in Photoshop on how to use it, and I'm going to go into some of my color correcting and editing techniques that I use in my images. So first of all, I want to show you a couple of basic things. Right now we have an unedited image up right now that was shot in my basement for one of my series. I don't tend to use backgrounds too much, because I'm going to cut everything out and edit it into a composite anyways later. So for right now, I'll show you some of the keyboard shortcuts. To zoom in, you press Control plus or Command plus if you're on a Mac, and every time you go in, you get closer, and to zoom out, you press Control or Command minus. And if you're really zoomed in and you want to get right back out, you press Control 0 and then you're at to fit the screen. So another thing that you should know is holding down the spacebar is a shortcut for the hand, and for all the time that you have the spacebar pressed, you'll have the hand tool active, so as you click you can pan around your image. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to duplicate this layer. So I'm going to press Control J or Command J on a Mac, and we're going to have a new layer. And on this layer we are going to brighten the image, just so I can show you how when you brighten the image you can get some more colors in it that you may not want, especially in the shadows. So to brighten before we brighten the image, we're going to rename this layer Brighten by double clicking just right on the text that said the layer, and we're going to type in Brighten. It's important to name your layers because when you have a lot of layers it will become very confusing. You should also group them, which I'll probably show in a future tutorial, so that you can keep track of the different layers. So right now to brighten, we're going to press Control M and the curves dialog box will come up. And what we're going to do, we're going to click on the midpoint right here in the middle of the graph, and we're going to push the middle point upwards towards the upper left corner. This is going to brighten the image. Midtones are brightened the most, and pretty well, you know, the highlights are about the same, shadows are about the same, and it gives a natural brightening to the image, since those things are kept pretty well at the same values. And right now we have our image brightened. Just eyeball how much you want. Right there we can see that we have some color in the shadows already, and you can see that the color was brought up in a lot of places. And now we're going to click OK. Now one thing that you can do to try and get rid of the color when you're trying to brighten an image is just click on the blend mode and select luminosity. And as you can see, it looks quite desaturated now. So that's not always an option, and we're not going to use that right now. We're going to leave it on normal. Now, what we're going to do next is that we're going to create a new merged layer. So it's going to be based on all the other layers. So to do that, we're going to press Control Alt Shift E. So that's Control Alt Shift E, and we're going to have a new layer, and we're going to name this one Color Clone. Since what we're going to do on this layer, we're going to change the blend mode to color. So now on this layer, everything we do will only affect the color. So what we're going to do next, we're going to have our clone stamp tool selected, and the shortcut key for that is just S. Just press S on the keyboard and you should have that, or you can select it from over here. It's the first tool in its pile. And what we're going to do, we're going to zoom in here, and there's quite, like, it's way too much, like, it's way off. Like, the shirt is light blue, and we want a lot more light blue in a lot of the areas here. So it's okay if we take a lot of the, like, Christmas light color away, because we're going to fix that in a little while. So what we're going to do, right now it doesn't matter about the intensity of the color. We're going to worry about that later. I'll show you how to deal with that. But first, what we're going to do, we're just going to try and make certain that the wavelength, or like the color, like since the blue shirt, we want most of this shirt to be blue. So what we're going to do, with the clone stamp tool selected, we're going to press Alt, and when you press Alt, anything you click on will be sampled. Now, in order to adjust the brush size of your tool, you can press the bracket keys. And to adjust the hardness, you can just right click, and then you have this box, and you can also from this box adjust the size of your brush, but you can also do the hardness here. Right now I have it at 0. That means it's really soft. That means you don't have any edges. At 100%, it's edged, like you have a solid edge as you brush around. So I like to usually keep it at 0 because I usually don't have like you just want to be subtle, and it helps you be more subtle in how you're brushing around, because you don't want to be overt. You don't want a solid line anywhere. You don't want like a streak color. You want everything to blend in a natural wet manner. So we're going to leave this at 0, and we're going to sample by holding down Alt, clicking on area that we want this area here to become in color. And one thing that you want to make certain is that aligned is unchecked, because when it's unchecked, that means we can just sample one area and then paint, and then let go, paint, let go, paint, and it keeps sampling from the exact same area. So if you find that it's not quite the correct color coming in, you can sample a different area. And if you mess up, press Ctrl Z. And if you've done two things that you've messed up, press Ctrl Alt Z and then Ctrl Alt Z again to go back 2 times. Because if you press Ctrl Z once and then you press it twice, it undoes and then redoes what you've just done. So we're going to paint around here a bit. And it's okay if the intensity of the color is a bit too high, because we're going to fix that later, as I said. So we're going to paint along here, around here. Okay, now we're continuing the painting across the image, and pretty well we just want to make all the little shadow areas good. And it's okay if you go over the side out of the image, because we're going to cut this out and make it into a composite later anyways. So okay, well, although we aren't quite done as much as I would do if we were actually editing this image to display somewhere, I'm going to skip ahead to the next tip I wanted to give in this tutorial. So I said earlier that we would deal with the intensity of the color later, so that's what we're going to do now. Because right now, you know, we've cloned the blue into the shadow area here, but that looks way too saturated. The intensity of the color is way too high. So we're going to create another merged layer by holding down Control Alt Shift E. On a Mac, the Alt key is the Option key, in case you're wondering. And what we're going to do on this layer, we're also going to set it to blend mode color, so we're still only working on color here. I like to separate color and luminosity from each other as I edit, and we're going to select the sponge tool. So to select it, you can right click on this part here and then you just select it out here, or you can hold down your left click and you can select it that way, or you can press O, and then you can just cycle through the tools by pressing Shift O until you have the sponge tool. Now we want to have the settings set to desaturate, and we want to turn vibrance off because we want to affect all colors. I like to, because vibrance, like, we just want it to affect the saturation. So what we're going to do here, since we're desaturating, all we have to do is paint over the areas that are too saturated. And you can increase the amount of desaturation that the brush does by increasing the flow. But I like to keep it pretty low, and you can paint over the same area a couple times. So as you paint over, you should be able to see the saturation coming down. And you paint over things until it looks about right to you. And you also, to change the intensity of your brush in how much it's painting, you can just press enter and then just enter in a number. Same thing. So right now I press enter and now I'm entering 30, so that brush is a little more powerful because it's quite a bit too saturated. So we just paint over it, and you know, it's the same as the clone tool in terms of how you can change the hardness. You just right click and you have the slider, and you have the bracket keys to change the size, and you just paint over things until the color is down enough so that it looks natural, because shadows naturally don't carry as much color as midtones or the brighter tones. So when you have shadow areas that have the same value of intensity of color as other areas in your photo, it's going to look really weird. Another thing that you could have done on the past layer to decrease the intensity of the color is lower the opacity, but the thing is, you'd have the color from the other layers bleed in by doing that. So sometimes trying different things works in Photoshop. You gotta kind of be creative. You gotta kind of try and think of new things to do, new ways to do things, because every project's different. You can't just have a technique that you create that will do everything. You gotta always be thinking on what you're gonna do. Now, I guess you pretty well get the point of desaturating the color. So now what I would want to do with this photo is these lights here. They're quite an important part of the image. You know, you want to make sure that they look as festive as possible, and you know, since we decreased saturation here and there, we should ensure that there is enough saturation coming from these lights that they really stand out. So we're going to create another merged layer by pressing Ctrl Alt Shift E, and we're going to name this one Christmas lights intensity. So pretty well that is intensity and saturation are the same thing when it comes to color. The more intense, the more saturated. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the brush tool. You can press B on your keyboard or select it from right here, and you have the brush tool. It's the first tool there in its group, and it's just like the clone tool or the sponge tool. You have the opacity slider, and you also have blend modes. Like, you don't have to just, you know, select a blend mode for the whole layer. You can select a blend mode for these tools. We could have done that with the clone tool, but not the sponge tool, because the sponge tool only affects color, so it only has one setting. But one of the problems in using the blend modes for the tools like the brush tool is that oftentimes you'll forget to change it back. So I like to just change the layer blend mode rather than change the tool blend mode, just to be safe. So right now we're on color again, color layer, so we're just still working on the color. That's all we're touching, because if it was normal, then as we paint over it would affect both luminosity and color, but now that we're on a color layer, it's just going to affect the color. So the thing that we're going to try and do here is we're going to sample the color from each Christmas light, and then we'll paint color around it. Now we want a soft brush, so we got to make certain it's at 0% in terms of how hard it is, so it's really nice and soft. And what we're going to do, just like with the clone tool, you can sample by holding down Alt and clicking on an area. So we're going to click on the most colorful part of the light bulb right here, and to make it our sample more colorful, we can click on our palette here, the foreground color, the one that's on top of the other color. We click on that, because that's the color that you're going to be painting with as you hold down, and we can increase the saturation. Right now it's at maximum, and we can also increase the brightness a little wee bit, and we're going to click OK, but you know, we couldn't, it was already at maximum saturation, but you can increase the saturation more so that it would stand out. We'll probably do that on a few of the other bulbs. And what we're going to do, we're going to decrease the opacity to 10. So I pressed enter and I typed in 10, so the opacity is now 10. So that's how much we're going to paint. And now we're going to make a brush size about this big around our light bulb right here, and we're going to just click on it once and it paints a little bit of color, and now we're going to make our brush a bit bigger and we're going to paint on it again, and you can see there's color now coming onto my hand. There's more color from that bulb. So we're going to do the same thing to this bulb right here too. We're going to select the color by pressing Alt and clicking, we're going to go to our palette here, and we're going to put it at maximum saturation by putting it to the right. We're going to click OK, and we're going to paint over it. We're going to click on it once at a smaller brush size, and then again at a larger brush size, and you can see a lot more color bleeding in right there. We have, looks quite a bit more, it stands out a lot more. And we're going to do that to all the bulbs, and once we're done, all the lights should look a lot more saturated. So I press Control 0 to zoom right out so we can look at our image, and I'm going to toggle this layer since I showed you how to increase the intensity of the color around these two bottom lights. So I'm going to just click on the eye here. When you click on the eye, the layer becomes invisible, so the effects on the image are going to disappear. And right there you can see how we added more color to those two bulbs. So if I was seriously editing this, I would do that to all the bulbs, but this is just for the tutorial here. There's still a lot more work to do with it, but that's pretty well what I do for color. And another thing I wanted to show you here is masking. That's one more thing I wanted to do with this editing tutorial, because that's a very important thing in Photoshop. Like, it is one of the best things ever, are masks. Everyone should know how to use masks. So the purpose of using layers is so that, you know, if you mess up, you could just delete the layer, or you can decrease the amount of effect that layer has by toggling the opacity. You can change its blend mode so that you can just edit one thing like color, like we've been doing. So layers are just great for just being more specific in your editing. So to add a mask to this layer that we're currently on, we press this icon right here, and now we have a mask, and it's connected to our layer. And right now, by default, you usually have the adjustment panel, but I like to have the mask panel up so I can see what I'm doing. And pretty well, density, you can decrease it so when it's 0, it means nothing that you paint, anything you paint on the mask, it's not going to show up. At 100%, everything on the mask is going to show up. It's the same thing as toggling the opacity slider. If you have it at 0, nothing on the layer is going to show up. You have it at 100, everything on the layer is going to show up. So on this layer, we painted color, more color intensity to these lights. So one thing that the masks can be used to do is just correct particular things. Like, let's say we like the color on the bottom light here, but we just don't want it on the top light, and we don't have to just delete the whole layer and start all over again. We just add a mask, and we make certain our brush tool is selected. And here is where you have to think more about the hardness of the brush, because when it's hard, it means you won't spread over as much. Because I'm going to enter 100, so my brush is set to 100, so pretty well that's its maximum setting. That means that everything I paint over on this layer is completely removed. So right now I painted over everything. It's like the layer was deleted. But instead we could just paint over a little bit of the area, and just that part of the layer is now gone. But what if we just wanted to lower the intensity of this top light here, but not, completely remove it? Then we would just change our opacity of our brush here to, let's say, 50%, and then that's just taking away half the intensity that we added to this light. So we paint over that, and now half the intensity is gone. And I'm pressing Control Z so we undo that. So right here, it takes more of what you want to create in terms of how hard or soft your brush is going to be. Usually, a lot of times I'll use it soft, because if it's a hard brush, you can kind of see the edge of the color as you're painting some of it away. But let's just say we wanted to keep the background here, and we didn't want this color on those snowshoes in the background there. We would put the hardness to about 78 because you don't want the hardness to be too hard, because then it looks unnatural, because it's going to be sharper than the sharpness in your picture if you have the the hardness all the way up to 100. But it's harder to see with color. But if you're painting with a brush and it's set to normal or luminosity and you're actually painting lines, it's going to look really, really hard. So if we wanted all the color that's on that snowshoe from what we painted on this layer to disappear, we would enter 100% opacity for a brush, and now we're going to paint over the snowshoe right here, and we're going to do it for both lights here. Now both lights aren't having an effect on the background. Now when it comes to the very, very edge here, you have to be very careful, because if you had a very, very soft brush, let me just demonstrate. If I had a soft brush about 0 and it was really big and I painted right here, it's going to bleed over onto me, because it's so soft. It's like a large gradient and it just goes right across. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. Like, you can't really see it right now because it's hard to see color when it's so little here, but we're going to put this back up 75%, and we're going to go in close to the edge of me, and we're just going to paint a line right down, because you really want to zoom in sometimes, because it's like coloring between the lines. You learn that when you're little, and you want to make certain that when you're editing, you're coloring between the lines. And right here I can see that there's a bit of color here that I still need to take out, so that it's not on this snowshoe. So I'm going to take that out. And you want to make certain that you don't paint over stuff you don't want to paint over. When it comes to luminosity, you like painting over things like that, you gotta be a lot more careful of going over the lines, because it's a lot more visible. Okay, now there's one more thing I wanted to show in this tutorial. I think I might have said that already about this tutorial. I think the last one was supposed to be the last one, but I have one more thing I want to show you here. A lot of people complain about chromatic aberrations in their image, and they think, oh, this lens is no good, or that lens is no good, which to an extent is true. But if you're creative and you're able to work hard, you can overcome some of these obstacles. I'm not talking about like lens profiles and that. I'm talking about just going in and desaturating hard, like bright edges, because there's quite a bit of contrast around these lights here, and there's clearly chromatic aberration. So I'm going to create another merged layer by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E, and I'm going to call this layer, I'm going to double click on where it says layer 2, and I'm going to call it just CA for chromatic aberration, and I'm going to change the blend mode to color, of course, because we just want to affect the color. And we're going to get the sponge tool out again, and this time we got to make certain that our hardness is really hard, because even 100%, because we're going to be just removing chromatic aberrations. We don't want the brush spilling over into the color that we really want to keep, and we've got to make certain that we're still on desaturate, and we're going to put our flow at 100, because we don't want any of this chromatic aberration to be showing up here. So right here, that red line, it's a bit too much. It's a chromatic aberration, so we're going to paint over that. And as you see, it goes away. So when it comes to the color fringing part of the aberrations, you can remove them by painting over them. Now, I wouldn't recommend, painting over every single chromatic aberration in all of your images, because that's going to kill you. But if you think it is really distracting in an image, just remove it, in Photoshop. Big deal, It just takes a bit more work. But I don't mind work. I like working in Photoshop, and I just like to edit a lot, so usually it takes me a day to edit my images, so that's why I only produce one image a day. So pretty well, you have to kind of paint over them a couple times with the aberrations, they go away, but you do kind of have a bit of a line still there. You could clone that out. That's another thing you could do. You could create another layer that's set to a normal blend mode, Actually, I'll just do that to show you. So I'm doing Control-Alt-Shift-E. We're going to have a new layer. I'm going to keep it on normal. I've selected my clone stamp tool. It's at 100% opacity, and we're going to make it hard because this is really close to an edge, and you know you want it to be pretty hard. So it's at 86%, and I'm going to use bracket keys to make it smaller. And we're going to have to zoom right in because when you're doing these hard, really precise touch-ups, you have to be zoomed right in. Like right now, we can see the pixels. By default, Photoshop has a pixel grid, but I believe you can turn it off. I think it's hard to remember. It might be. I think you have to go to Preferences by pressing Control K, and Units and Rulers, somewhere in here. Well, anyways, it's somewhere in here, and you can turn it off because I find it really annoying. Because, you know, I don't really get why there has to be a pixel grid by default. So I'm just gonna clone because it's somewhere in here and I know it. Okay, I'll just forget about that. But anyways, we can clone out this hard edge because even if you know you've removed the color and it's still annoying, you can just clone it out. And you gotta be careful when you clone because you gotta make certain that you're. Wait, right now you can turn the line back on so that you keep cloning from the same area. Because you see right here, I'm gonna let go, and now I'm gonna start cloning again, and you see it's continuing along. If I had aligned unchecked, it would have resampled from back over here. So pretty well what it's doing when it's aligned, it is kind of like following what you're cloning, and even when you let go, it's going to clone from the same spot that you just left on. And you gotta resample a lot of times when you're cloning. You gotta keep resampling and making certain that you're getting it from the correct spot, because you don't want to, like, it just takes practice to get the hang of where to clone from. But really, I wouldn't pay too much attention to this aberration because it is such a minor thing. But for those people who get really annoyed by it, which I sometimes do, but there's so much color in this area, it doesn't really matter too much if there's a bit of aberration there. So I can turn these layers off, and you can kind of see how we removed the aberration there. There, it's all back, and right there. Yeah, I'm just toggling the visibility of the layers. So pretty well that's all I wanted to show you for the color for my introductory tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope that I'll be able to produce more tutorials for you guys. I hope you enjoy them. Thanks.
So I will continue producing lessons for this tutorial if people are interested in paying. Once I have the tutorials completed, I will be displaying them on my Billy Wilson Photography Tutorials Google Plus page, and I will make them available to those who first circle the page, then pay me through PayPal, and include a link back to their Google Plus profile so I can circle them back. I will also have images available for people to work on my tutorial page. As an add-on, I will try to initiate Hangouts and answer questions from time to time from my tutorial page. I hope things go well, and I hope to be able to produce many helpful videos for you guys.